The spring morning arrived in Madrid with that peculiar golden light that made the terracotta facades glow like amber. Isabella de Alcantara stood before the tall mirror in her chambers, watching her lady's maid adjust the final details of her sapphire blue gown. The silk whispered against her skin with each movement, and the tight corset made her breathing shallow. Though she'd learned to hide the discomfort behind perfect posture, her chestnut hair had been arranged in an elaborate updo, small curls framing her face, and the family pearl necklace rested against her collarbone like a cold reminder of everything she was supposed to be. "You look magnificent, my lady," the maid said softly, stepping back to admire her work. Isabella's emerald eyes studied her reflection without joy. Magnificent. The word felt hollow. In 3 hours she would be formally presented to the court at the spring royal banquet, the moment she'd been preparing for since her wedding 6 months ago. 6 months of sleeping in separate chambers, of formal dinners where Fernando barely looked at her, of walking through the palace halls feeling more like a ghost than a princess. The carriage ride to the royal palace was silent except for the rhythmic clatter of hooves on cobblestones. Isabella watched through the window as Madrid passed by, the wide Paseo del Prado lined with plane trees just beginning to leaf out, ladies with lace parasols strolling beneath them, gentlemen in top hats tipping their heads in greeting. Everything looked so normal, so perfectly ordered, while inside her chest anxiety coiled like a snake. When they arrived at the palace, Isabella was directed to a small antechamber near the gardens. Protocol dictated she wait there until the announcement. Through the window she could see the formal French gardens where the banquet would take place. Long tables draped in white linen stretched across the manicured lawns, silver gleaming under the morning sun. Roses, jasmine, and lavender perfumed the air so heavily she could smell it even inside. Fountains with mythological sculptures sprayed water in elegant arcs, and white marble statues stood sentinel between the tree-lined paths. A young page appeared at the door. "My lady, they're about to begin the announcements." Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs. She smoothed her skirts one final time, lifted her chin the way her mother had taught her, and prepared to step into her new life as Princess Isabella de Bourbon. But the page didn't lead her to the garden entrance. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably. "Forgive me, my lady. There's been a change. You're to wait here a moment longer." "A change?" Isabella's voice came out steadier than she felt. "I don't have details, my lady. I'm sure someone will explain shortly." He disappeared before she could ask more. Isabella moved to the window, her hands gripping the stone sill. Below, she watched as the master of ceremonies stepped forward, his voice carrying across the garden, though she couldn't make out the words. The crowd turned toward the main palace entrance, a ripple of anticipation moving through them. Then she saw him. Prince Fernando de Bourbon emerged from the palace, tall and imposing in his military ceremonial uniform, the medals and decorations glinting on his chest. His black hair was slicked back with brilliantine, his dark eyes scanning the crowd with that familiar arrogance. Her husband, the man who had barely spoken 20 words to her in the past week. But he wasn't alone. On his arm, dressed in a gown of crimson silk that seemed to bleed color into the spring garden, was Countess HAZEL Valdemar. Her golden hair was arranged in an elaborate coiffure, curls cascading down her back, topped with a small diamond tiara that caught the sunlight. Even from this distance, Isabella could see the triumphant smile on her porcelain face, the possessive way her gloved hand rested on Fernando's arm. The master of ceremonies' voice reached Isabella's window now, clear and formal. "His Royal Highness, Prince Fernando de Bourbon, accompanied by the Countess HAZEL Valdemar." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. The crowd erupted in polite applause, but beneath it she could see heads turning, mouths hidden behind fans, whispers spreading like wildfire. They knew. Everyone knew what this meant. She was the prince's wife, yet another woman was being presented as his official companion at the most important social event of the season. Isabella's legs nearly gave out. She grabbed the window frame to steady herself, her breath coming in short gasps that the corset made even more difficult. The humiliation was so complete, so public, that for a moment she couldn't process it. This wasn't a private slight, a quiet dismissal. This was Fernando declaring to all of Madrid's aristocracy that she, his legal wife, meant nothing to him. A knock at the door made Isabella spin around. An older woman entered, her gray hair pulled into a severe bun, her dress a somber navy blue. She wore a lorgnette on a chain around her neck and carried herself with the kind of authority that came from decades navigating court politics. "Lady Isabella," the woman said, her voice neither warm nor cold, simply stating a fact. "I am Donna Carmen Lopez. I served your late mother-in-law, may she rest in peace. Why am I still here?" Isabella's voice cracked, despite her efforts to control it. Why wasn't I announced? Donna Carmen's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her shrewd brown eyes. Because your husband is a fool who believes power is taken through cruelty rather than earned through wisdom. The Countess has been angling for this moment for months. She convinced Fernando that presenting her instead of you would demonstrate his independence from the marriage arrangement. But I'm his wife. The words sounded pathetic even to Isabella's ears. Yes, you are. And that's precisely why this is such a magnificent mistake on his part. Donna Carmen turned from the window, her lorgnette catching the light. Tell me, child, what do you plan to do now? Isabella had no answer. Her whole life she'd been taught to endure, to accept, to smile through pain. What can I do? You can hide in this room and confirm every whisper that you're a weak, insignificant girl who accepted this marriage for the title. Or you can go down there and remind Madrid that you are Lady Isabella de Alcantara, descended from one of Spain's oldest noble houses. And no one, not even a prince, dismisses you without consequences. The old woman's words struck something deep inside Isabella, something that had been sleeping beneath layers of propriety and obedience. She thought of her grandmother, who'd held their crumbling estate together through 2 wars. She thought of her mother, who'd negotiated this marriage from a position of weakness but never let anyone see her doubt. How, Isabella whispered, how do I face them after this? You walk into that garden with your head high. You greet every person who matters with grace and confidence. You make it clear that you are not intimidated, not broken, and most importantly, not going anywhere. Donna Carmen picked up Isabella's discarded gloves from a side table and handed them to her. The Countess wants you to disappear. Fernando expects you to dissolve into tears. Give them the opposite. Show them steel wrapped in silk. Isabella's hands shook as she pulled on the gloves. Through the window she could see the banquet in full swing now. Fernando and Hazel held court at the center of everything, surrounded by laughing courtiers and curious onlookers. The sight made her stomach turn, but beneath the nausea, something else was building. Anger. Pure, clarifying anger. They're all watching to see what I'll do, Isabella said, more to herself than to Donna Carmen. Yes, and that, my dear, is your opportunity. The older woman moved toward the door. I'll be in the garden. When you're ready, find me. Then she was gone, and Isabella stood alone in the antechamber. Her reflection in the mirror showed a young woman in a beautiful gown with terror in her emerald eyes. But as she watched, something shifted. Her spine straightened, her jaw set. Isabella walked to the door, paused with her hand on the handle, and took one deep breath. Then she stepped out into the palace corridor and made her way toward the gardens. The moment she emerged onto the garden path, conversations faltered. Heads turned. The whispers that had been circulating about her absence suddenly had to contend with her presence. Isabella kept her pace measured, unhurried, as if she'd planned to arrive at exactly this moment. She spent hours in that garden, speaking with every influential person she could find, her head high despite the stares and whispers. When Fernando finally approached her near one of the fountains, his face dark with barely controlled anger, Isabella met his eyes without flinching. "You weren't supposed to come down," he said, not quite a question. "No, I must have misunderstood. I was told this was a royal banquet, and as I am royalty by marriage, I assumed my presence was required." Her voice was perfectly calm, betraying none of the fury burning beneath her skin. "You're making this difficult." "Making what difficult, exactly? Attending a social event? I'm confused about what I could possibly be doing wrong." His hand shot out, gripping her arm. Not painfully, but firmly enough to convey anger. "Watch your tongue." "Or what?" "You'll ignore me more than you already do." Isabella didn't try to pull away, just looked pointedly at where his hand held her arm. "People are watching, Your Highness. I wonder what they'll think about a prince manhandling his wife at a public event." Fernando released her immediately, and Isabella walked away without waiting for his response. That night, alone in her room, she allowed herself to feel everything she'd suppressed. The humiliation, the anger, the fear. But she also fell asleep planning, thinking, preparing. Because one thing had become crystal clear: she would not be erased. The following weeks unfolded with careful precision. Isabella threw herself into charitable work, visiting schools for working-class girls in Madrid's poorest neighborhoods. She established her own salon, hosting Thursday evening gatherings where writers, politicians, and artists discussed ideas that mattered. With Donna Carmen as her mentor, she learned to navigate court politics, to build alliances, to recognize power and how to claim it for herself. One morning in late May, Isabella stood in a cramped classroom in the Lafapiés district, watching young girls practice their letters. The air smelled of chalk dust and determination. The teacher explained their challenges with limited supplies and too many students. "I'll speak to the Duchess about increasing funding to this school," Isabella said, "and I'd like to visit again next month to see the progress." The teacher's eyes widened. You'd come back yourself? Why wouldn't I? This work matters, Isabella smiled, realizing it was genuine. Here in this cramped classroom, she felt more real than she ever did at court. Word of her involvement spread through Madrid's charitable networks. Her salons became increasingly influential, attracting cabinet ministers and progressive thinkers. She was becoming, slowly but steadily, a figure in her own right. Fernando noticed. She saw him at various court functions, always with Hazel at his side, but increasingly she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Isabella needed her own household, her own space. Using the leverage of her position, she secured an allowance from Fernando and leased a graceful palazzo on Paso del Prado. Moving in felt like claiming territory. She chose rich, jewel-toned fabrics, hung paintings by contemporary Spanish artists, created a library where her salons could flourish. Her father visited during preparations, pride and concern mixing on his face. You're really doing this? Creating your own household? I have to, Papa. This is my space, my foundation. Everything I build starts here. The palazzo opened with a small gathering that became the talk of Madrid's cultural circles. Isabella's influence grew with each passing week. She was no longer just the prince's ignored wife. She was Lady Isabella, patron of the arts, advocate for education, host of the city's most intellectually vibrant salon. When Fernando finally confronted her at a reception in late June, demanding she stop her activities, Isabella refused. For the first time in their marriage, she stood her ground completely. I'm not competing with you, Fernando. I'm simply existing in my own right. Is that really so threatening? The confrontation was public enough that word spread through court circles immediately. Princess Isabella had defied her husband. The balance of power in their marriage had shifted irrevocably. Summer turned to autumn, and Isabella's confidence grew with each small victory. Then came the summons from Queen Regent Maria Cristina herself. The meeting was formal, attended by royal advisors, and the Queen's questions were direct. I've been hearing interesting things about you. Some say you're a dedicated philanthropist. Others say you're an ambitious troublemaker. Maria Cristina studied Isabella carefully. I wanted to hear the truth from you directly. Isabella met the Queen's eyes steadily. I've been trying to find a way to contribute meaningfully while navigating a difficult situation. My husband has made his preferences clear, and they don't include me. But I'm still a princess. Still part of this family. I thought building positive influence was appropriate. And the open confrontation with your husband? He came to my home and demanded I cease all my public work. I refused. Perhaps I could have been more diplomatic, but I won't apologize for defending work that genuinely helps people. The Queen Regent studied her for a long moment, then smiled slightly. My husband's family has always had this problem. The men expect absolute obedience, and they never quite understand why intelligent women might resist. She paused. I can't force Fernando to treat you well, but I can make it clear that you have my support for your charitable work, and that any attempts to undermine you will be viewed unfavorably by the crown. Relief flooded through Isabella. With the Queen Regent's support, Fernando could no longer pressure her to disappear. She had space to continue building her own life. But victory was short-lived. In February, Donna Carmen arrived with devastating news. Hazel is pregnant. Fernando is seeking an annulment. The words hung in the air. Isabella set down her pen slowly, processing the implications. Without the marriage, she would lose her title, her position, everything she'd built. Over the following weeks, they worked systematically to protect Isabella's interests. Donna Carmen gathered letters of support, testimonials, detailed records of every contribution Isabella had made to Madrid's cultural and charitable life. When Isabella was summoned again to meet with the Queen Regent, she was prepared. Prince Fernando has approached me about seeking an annulment, Maria Cristina said. He claims the marriage was never consummated and that you've been living separate lives. The unconsummated part is true. The separate lives became true only after he made it clear he wanted nothing to do with me. Isabella kept her voice steady. I would prefer to remain married, but I won't fight to stay married to a man who doesn't want me. An elderly bishop spoke up. The prince suggests you might be amenable to entering a convent. That would be a dignified resolution. A convent? Isabella couldn't hide her incredulity. I'm 24 years old. I have work I'm passionate about, and I have no religious calling. Why would I enter a convent? In other words, I should disappear quietly so Fernando can legitimize his child and marry his mistress. Isabella looked directly at the Queen. Is that what you're asking me to do, Your Majesty? Maria Cristina leaned forward. What if your work could continue even without the royal title? What if we arranged it so your charitable foundations retained their funding, your schools remained open, your position in society remained secure? I cannot stop Fernando from pursuing an annulment if he's determined. but I can ensure you're protected financially and socially afterward. Isabella understood the reality of her situation. Fight and lose publicly, or negotiate terms that would allow her work to continue. I need time to consider. You have 1 week. Isabella left the palace feeling trapped, but over the following days clarity emerged. She called Donna Carmen to her palazzo. I've decided. I'll agree to the annulment, but on my terms. I want guaranteed funding for all my charitable projects for 5 years. I want to retain this house and sufficient income to maintain it. And I want a public statement from the Queen Regent making clear that the annulment is sought by Fernando, not me. The negotiations took 2 weeks. Fernando, eager for resolution, agreed to everything. The annulment was announced in late May with carefully worded statements praising Isabella's charitable work and making clear the dissolution reflected Fernando's choices, not any failure of hers. The transition was strange and painful. Isabella stopped being Princess Isabella de Bourbon and reverted to Lady Isabella de Alcantara. The shift felt like losing part of her identity. But there were unexpected freedoms, too. She could speak more candidly without worrying about royal protocol. She could support controversial causes without needing approval. She could build relationships based on genuine connection rather than political necessity. Fernando married Hazel in June. Their son was born in July, immediately legitimized. Isabella heard about it at a distance and felt more relief than pain. That life, that possibility, was truly behind her now. Summer brought new rhythm to Isabella's days. She spent more time at the schools, no longer dividing attention between charitable work and court obligations. Her salons evolved, becoming more openly progressive. She started writing under her own name, publishing essays arguing for women's education and social reform. One August evening, she sat in her library with Donna Carmen, reviewing plans for expanding the school system. "You seem different," Donna Carmen observed. "More settled, somehow." "I feel different. For the first time since I came to Madrid, I'm not pretending to be something I'm not. I'm not performing any role other than myself." Isabella looked up from the papers. "It's strange. I lost everything I thought I wanted, but I feel more like myself than ever. That's because what you thought you wanted wasn't what you actually needed. You needed purpose, autonomy, the chance to build something meaningful. The royal title was just window dressing." Autumn arrived with its usual transformation. Isabella's schools opened for a new academic year with enrollment increased by 40%. Her salons attracted an even more diverse crowd. On an October morning, crisp and clear, Isabella stood in the courtyard of one of her schools, watching students arrive. Their faces were scrubbed clean, their worn clothes neat as possible, their eyes bright with eagerness. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, stopped in front of Isabella. "Are you Lady Isabella, the one who made the school?" "I am. What's your name?" "Maria Letters. My mother says you gave her hope." "She says now. I can learn to read and maybe be something more than a laundress like her." "You can be anything you work to become." "Maria Letters, that's what the school is for." The girl smiled and ran off to join her classmates. Isabella watched her go, feeling the weight and wonder of what she'd built. These children, these opportunities, this genuine change in real people's lives. This was what all the struggle had been for. She thought back to that terrible spring day 18 months ago, standing in an antechamber watching her husband present another woman to the court, feeling like her world was ending. In a way, it had been ending. The life she'd expected, the identity she'd been given, the path that had been chosen for her, all of that had died that day. But something else had been born. Something she'd built herself through pain and determination and the slow accumulation of small victories. She was no longer the frightened girl who'd arrived in Madrid for an arranged marriage. She was Lady Isabella de Alcantara, educator, patron, reformer, and builder of futures for girls who might otherwise have none. She was someone who mattered, not because of who she'd married, but because of what she'd chosen to become. The morning bell rang, calling students to their lessons. Isabella took a deep breath of autumn air, feeling the sun warm on her face, hearing the sounds of children's voices and the city waking around her. She had work to do, schools to run, plans to make, futures to shape. And for the first time since she'd come to Madrid, she looked forward to it all with something that felt remarkably like joy. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it cold winds from the Guadarrama mountains that swept through Madrid's streets. Isabella wrapped herself in a wool cloak as she walked through the Retiro Park one December afternoon, the bare trees casting skeletal shadows across the frozen paths. She was meeting a potential donor for the schools, a wealthy industrialist named Don Augusto Herrera, who'd expressed interest in funding a new building. He was already waiting by the lake when she arrived, a tall man in his late 40s with graying temples and shrewd eyes that assessed her carefully. Lady Isabella, thank you for meeting me, Don Augusto. I appreciate your interest in our educational initiative. Isabella gestured toward a bench sheltered from the wind. Shall we sit? As they discussed funding and construction plans, Isabella noticed something unexpected in his manner. He wasn't just interested in the schools as a charitable cause. He was interested in her. The realization came gradually through small signals, the way his attention lingered. The personal questions woven between business discussions, the invitation to dinner that had nothing to do with education. I should be direct, Lady Isabella, he said finally, his breath visible in the cold air. I admire your work tremendously, but I also admire you. I'm a widower, as you may know. I have no heirs, considerable wealth, and I find myself drawn to a woman of substance and intelligence. Would you consider allowing me to court you properly? The question caught Isabella completely off guard. In the year and a half since her annulment, she'd been so focused on her work that romance hadn't even crossed her mind. She looked at Don Augusto, respectable, wealthy, genuinely interested in her accomplishments. He represented security, partnership, a conventional path forward. I'm honored by your interest, Isabella said carefully, but I need to be honest. My work is my priority. I won't give it up for marriage or any other arrangement. I wouldn't ask you to. In fact, I'd support it. Imagine what we could accomplish together. Your vision, my resources. We could open schools across Spain, not just Madrid. His enthusiasm was genuine, his proposal practical rather than romantic. Isabella asked for time to consider, and Don Augusto agreed graciously. Walking back to her palazzo through streets decorated for Christmas, she felt confused. This was what women in her position were supposed to want, a respectable remarriage. Financial security, social restoration, yet something in her resisted. That evening, Dona Carmen visited for their weekly review of foundation business. Isabella mentioned the proposal almost casually, but the older woman's sharp eyes caught every nuance of her tone. You don't want to accept, Dona, Carmen said. It wasn't a question. I don't know what I want. He's offering everything that makes sense, support for my work, financial stability, respectability. Why does it feel wrong? Because you've tasted freedom, and you're afraid of losing it again. Dona Carmen poured them both wine. Marriage to Don Augusto might be partnership rather than subjugation, but it's still marriage. Your work would become our work. Your decisions would require consultation. Your independence would be compromised. Is that selfish, to choose independence over partnership? It's honest, and honesty is never selfish. The older woman studied Isabella thoughtfully. You're not the girl who married Fernando anymore. That girl was taught to define herself through relationships, daughter, wife, princess. The woman you've become defines herself through her work and her choices. Don Augusto is offering you a return to the first model, even if it's a better version. Isabella sat with that insight through the long winter nights. She attended Christmas Mass at San Geronimo, watching Fernando and Hazel with their infant son, feeling nothing but distant curiosity. She hosted a New Year's salon that lasted until dawn, filled with passionate debates about Spain's future. She visited her schools, watching the girls learn and grow, feeling her chest swell with pride. In mid-January, she invited Don Augusto to her palazzo and gave him her answer. You're a good man and your offer is generous. But I've built a life that's entirely mine, and I'm not ready to share that autonomy with anyone, no matter how supportive they might be. I hope we can still work together on the schools, but as colleagues, not as husband and wife. He accepted with grace, disappointment clear in his eyes, but respect as well. You're remarkable, Lady Isabella. Any man would be lucky to have you, but I understand why you choose yourself instead. The funding offer stands regardless. After he left, Isabella stood at her window, watching snow begin to fall over the Paseo del Prado. She felt no regret, only a deep sense of rightness. This was her life, built from ruins and refusal, from pain transformed into purpose. She didn't need a man to validate it or complete it. Spring returned to Madrid with its usual explosion of color and life. Isabella's network had grown to include women across Spain who were building similar educational initiatives. She began organizing a national conference to be held in Madrid that summer, bringing together educators, reformers, and philanthropists to share strategies and resources. The planning consumed her days, but in the best possible way. She corresponded with teachers in Barcelona, with the Duchess in Seville running literacy programs, with a doctor in Valencia who'd opened a clinic attached to a girls' school. The scope of what they were building together felt revolutionary. A quiet transformation happening in classrooms and clinics across the country. One April morning, Isabella was in her study reviewing conference schedules when her butler announced an unexpected visitor. Prince Fernando, my lady. He asked if you'll receive him. Isabella's first instinct was to refuse, but curiosity won. Show him in. Fernando entered, looking older than when she'd last seen him up close. His uniform was as immaculate as ever, his posture still militarily straight. but there were shadows under his eyes and new lines around his mouth. He stood awkwardly in the doorway of her study, seeming uncertain for perhaps the first time since she'd known him. "Isabella, thank you for seeing me. This is unexpected. What brings you here?" She didn't stand or offer him a seat, maintaining formal distance. "I wanted to double quotes." He stopped, started again. "I owe you an apology. For how I treated you during our marriage, for the humiliation at the banquet, for all of it." Isabella studied him, trying to understand what had prompted this. "What changed?" "Hazel left. 3 months ago. She took our son to Paris, said she needed time away from Madrid. She writes occasionally, but—" He trailed off, moving to the window. "I thought I knew what I wanted. I thought power came from doing whatever I pleased, consequences be damned. I was wrong, and now you want what? Forgiveness? Reconciliation?" Isabella kept her voice neutral, but inside she felt only tired disinterest in his drama. "I don't know what I want. I just know that I look at what you've built, the schools, the respect you've earned, the actual difference you're making, and I realize I have nothing comparable. My life is empty ceremonies and political maneuvering that doesn't matter." He turned from the window, his dark eyes meeting hers. "You were right that day in your study. I underestimated you completely. Yes, you did. But I'm not particularly interested in your regrets, Fernando." Isabella stood, moving to her desk to emphasize that she had work to do. "You made your choices, I made mine. We're both living with the consequences. I've moved on, and I suggest you do the same. Could we perhaps be friends?" "I know I have no right to ask, but no." The word was firm but not cruel. "We can be civil when required at public functions. We can cooperate if our interests align on some matter. But friends? That requires trust and respect, neither of which exists between us. I'm not angry anymore, Fernando. I'm simply indifferent. And that's all I have the energy to be." He absorbed this with a nod, something like resignation settling over his features. "You've become formidable." "I see that now. I've become myself. There's a difference." Isabella gestured toward the door, a clear dismissal. "I have a conference to organize. Was there anything else?" Fernando left without another word. Isabella returned to her desk, picked up her pen, and continued working on the conference schedule as if the interruption had been nothing more significant than a delivery boy bringing mail. Because that's all it had been, a brief interruption in a life too full and meaningful to dwell on the past. The National Women's Education Conference took place in July, held in a grand hall near the Plaza Mayor that Isabella had secured through a combination of charm and strategic donations. Over 300 women attended from across Spain, filling the space with energy and purpose. Educators shared teaching methods, doctors discussed health education for girls, philanthropists pledged funding, and politicians debated policy reforms. Isabella opened the conference with a speech that surprised even herself with its passion. "We are not here to beg for scraps from men's tables. We are here to build our own tables, set our own places, and invite whoever wishes to join a feast of knowledge and opportunity. Education is not charity, it is investment in our nation's future. Every girl we teach to read is a woman who can advocate for herself and her children. Every woman who learns is a family lifted from ignorance into possibility." The applause was thunderous. Over the 3 days of the conference, Isabella moved through the crowds, connecting people, facilitating collaborations, watching networks form that would outlast any single person's effort. This was larger than her now, a movement that had taken on its own momentum. On the final evening after the closing ceremonies, Isabella stood on the steps of the hall watching attendees depart. Dona Carmen joined her, both women tired but satisfied. "You've done something remarkable here," the older woman said. "This isn't just a conference. It's the beginning of real change." "We've done something remarkable," Isabella corrected. "I couldn't have built any of this without your guidance." "Perhaps not, but you had the courage to try, even when it seemed impossible. That was all you, child." Dona Carmen squeezed her arm gently. "Your mother would be proud. I'm proud." Walking back to her palazzo through warm summer evening, Isabella felt a profound sense of completion. Not the completion of work finished, there would always be more schools to open, more girls to educate, more barriers to break, but the completion of a journey from the terrified young woman in that antechamber to the confident leader who just orchestrated a national conference. The city lights glowed around her as she crossed the Plaza Mayor. Musicians playing in the arcades, families strolling after dinner, Madrid alive with summer energy. This was her city now in a way it had never been when she was a princess. She belonged here not because of a title or a marriage, but because she'd earned her place through work that mattered. Autumn settled over Madrid once again, completing the cycle. 2 years since that devastating spring banquet. and Isabella's life had transformed so completely that the woman she'd been then seemed like a stranger. She was 30 now, still young, but carrying the confidence of someone who'd survived fire and emerged stronger. The schools were thriving, with plans to open 3 more facilities by next spring. Her salons had become essential stops for anyone interested in progressive thought in Madrid. She was writing a book about women's education, drawing on 2 years of practical experience. Publishers were interested, though some balked at the political implications of her arguments. On a crisp October afternoon, Isabella stood once again in the courtyard of her first school, watching a new generation of students arrive. Some were sisters of the first students, others were neighbors who'd heard about the opportunity. Among them was Maria, the little girl who'd thanked her 2 years ago. Now 9 years old and one of the school's best students. Lady Isabella. Maria ran up, her face bright with excitement. I wrote a story. My teacher says it's very good. Would you like to read it? Isabella took the carefully written pages, reading about a girl who became a teacher and opened her own school. The story was simple but heartfelt, filled with the kind of hope that education makes possible. This is wonderful, Maria letters. You should be very proud. I want to be like you when I grow up, the girl said earnestly. I want to help other girls learn. Isabella knelt down so they were eye to eye. Then you will. And when you do, you'll build on what we started here, and you'll make it even better. That's how progress works. Each generation building on the one before. As Maria ran off to join her friends, Isabella stood slowly, feeling the weight and wonder of that simple exchange. This was legacy, not a title passed down, not wealth inherited, but knowledge and opportunity expanding outward in ripples that would long outlast her. She looked up at the building that housed the school, at the sign above the door that read, Academy of Hope. Such a simple name, but it captured everything they were doing here. Giving hope to girls who might otherwise have none, opening doors that had always been closed, proving that change was possible when people cared enough to make it happen. The afternoon sun painted Madrid's terracotta rooftops in shades of gold and amber. Church bells rang the hour from San Geronimo. Vendors called out from the Plaza Mayor. Life continuing, always continuing, with its mixture of beauty and struggle, joy and sorrow, defeat and triumph. Isabella had tasted all of it in the past 2 years. She'd been humiliated and discarded, but she'd refused to disappear. She'd been powerless, but she'd built power from nothing. She'd lost everything she thought she wanted, but she'd gained something infinitely more valuable, herself, fully realized, completely her own. The evening grew cool, and Isabella pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She had dinner plans with Dona Carmen, then correspondence to answer, then revisions on her book manuscript. Her life was full, perhaps too full, but she wouldn't have it any other way. As she walked toward her waiting carriage, Isabella glanced back one last time at the school, at the children visible through the windows bent over their lessons. Each one of them a future being shaped, a possibility being nurtured, a small revolution in progress. This was what mattered. Not titles or position or social standing, but the concrete, measurable difference in real people's lives. Fernando could have his empty ceremonies and political games. HAZEL could have whatever she'd chased to Paris. Isabella had something infinitely better. She had purpose. She had impact. She had a life that was entirely, authentically, triumphantly her own. The winter of 1887 brought unexpected challenges. A severe influenza outbreak swept through Madrid's poorest neighborhoods, hitting hardest where families lived in crowded conditions with little access to medical care. Isabella's schools became makeshift aid stations, distributing food and medicine, coordinating with doctors willing to treat patients regardless of ability to pay. Isabella worked 18-hour days, her elegant gowns replaced by simple dark dresses suitable for visiting sick rooms. She held feverish children while doctors examined them, carried soup to families too weak to cook, wrote letters to wealthy patrons begging for emergency funds. The work was exhausting and often heartbreaking, but it felt essential in a way nothing else ever had. One freezing February night, Isabella was leaving the Lavapiés school after midnight when she found a young woman collapsed against the building's wall, barely conscious. The woman clutched a bundle to her chest, a baby maybe 6 months old wrapped in threadbare blankets. "Help," the woman whispered. "Please." "My baby." Isabella knelt in the snow, checking the infant. The child was burning with fever, lips tinged blue from cold. Without hesitation, Isabella gathered them both, calling for her coachman. "Hospital de la Princesa. As fast as you can." At the hospital, Isabella used every ounce of her former royal connection and current reputation to ensure immediate care. She stayed through the night as doctors worked. The young mother, her name was Lucia, gripping Isabella's hand with desperate strength. "I can't pay," Lucia whispered. "I have nothing. My husband died in a factory accident 3 months ago. I've been trying to work as a laundress, but with the baby... Don't worry about payment. Just focus on your daughter getting better." Isabella smoothed the woman's sweat-damp hair from her forehead. "What's her name, Isabella?" "I named her Isabella." Lucia's eyes filled with tears. "After you. I heard about your schools, about how you help people like us. I thought maybe if I gave her your name, she'd have your strength." The words struck Isabella's heart like a physical blow. She sat beside this exhausted young mother in a charity ward, holding her hand, and understood that everything she'd built had rippled out in ways she could never fully comprehend. She wasn't just opening schools or hosting salons. She was giving people hope, showing them that change was possible, that someone cared whether they survived or suffered. The baby survived, though it took 2 weeks of careful nursing. Isabella visited daily, bringing food and warm clothes, arranging for Lucia to receive training as a seamstress, work she could do at home while caring for her daughter. When they finally left the hospital, Lucia embraced Isabella with fierce gratitude. "I'll never forget this. Never. And I'll make sure my Isabella knows that the woman she's named for saved her life." Walking back to her carriage through melting snow, Isabella felt something shift inside her. The work had always been important, but it had also been somewhat abstract, opening schools, organizing conferences, writing essays. Now it was viscerally, undeniably personal. She'd held a dying child named after her and fought for that child's life. The stakes couldn't be clearer. She returned to her palazzo that evening and immediately wrote to every contact she had, launching a campaign to establish a proper medical clinic attached to each school. Children couldn't learn if they were sick, and mothers couldn't work if they were constantly terrified their children would die from preventable illness. Education and healthcare had to go together. The response was overwhelming. Donors who'd been lukewarm about education funding became passionate about the medical initiative. Within 3 months, Isabella had secured enough money to open the first clinic in Lavapes, staffed by young doctors who believed in treating patients regardless of their ability to pay. Spring arrived like a resurrection, and with it came a letter that would change everything. It was from Paris, written in an elegant hand on expensive stationery. Isabella almost didn't open it, assuming it was another funding request. But something made her break the seal. The letter was from HAZEL. "Lady Isabella, I'm writing to you because I find myself in a position I never imagined, in need of help from the woman I once tried to destroy. Life has a cruel sense of irony. Fernando has cut off all financial support. He's demanded I return to Madrid and to him, but I refuse. Paris is my home now, and I won't return to a man who treated me as a possession rather than a person.
Okay.
I'm raising our son alone, with dwindling resources and few options. I'm not asking for money. I'm asking for advice. You managed to build a life independent of Fernando, to create something meaningful when everything was taken from you. How did you do it? How did you survive when the world told you to disappear? I know I have no right to ask anything of you. I was cruel, calculating, and destructive. But I'm also desperate, and you're the only woman I know who's successfully escaped the trap I find myself in. If you choose not to respond, I'll understand. But if you have any wisdom to share, I would be deeply grateful." HAZEL Valdemar Isabella read the letter 3 times, emotions cycling from disbelief to anger to something uncomfortably close to pity. HAZEL, who'd seemed so powerful and untouchable, was now alone and struggling in a foreign city. The poetic justice was almost too perfect. Donna Carmen's reaction when Isabella showed her the letter was swift and decisive. "Don't respond." She made her choices. Let her live with the consequences. "You owe her nothing. I know I don't owe her anything, but... Isabella stared out the window at the spring afternoon, at Madrid blooming with new life. "I keep thinking about what you told me once, that women like us survive by being clever and strong. HAZEL was clever, but she used it to hurt people. What if she could learn to use it differently? You're too forgiving. Not forgiving. Strategic." Isabella turned from the window, her mind already working through possibilities. If HAZEL stays in Paris struggling and bitter, she becomes another cautionary tale about fallen women. But if she rebuilds herself, if she learns from her mistakes, she could become an ally. Someone who understands both sides of the aristocratic game. You're serious about helping her? I'm serious about not letting hate dictate my choices. She tried to destroy me and failed. I became stronger because of it. Maybe she can too. Isabella picked up her pen. Besides, there's a certain satisfaction in being the bigger person. The letter, Isabella wrote back, was brief but genuine. She outlined the practical steps she'd take in building networks, finding meaningful work, creating value independent of male support. She suggested HAZEL consider teaching French or music to wealthy Parisian families, leveraging her aristocratic background in education. She even provided names of contacts in Paris who might help. At the end, Isabella added a personal note. You were right about one thing. We are both intelligent women who understand power. The difference is that I learned to build power with others rather than over them. If you can learn that distinction, you'll survive. If not, you'll keep repeating the same destructive patterns. The choice is yours. The response came 6 weeks later. HAZEL had secured a position teaching etiquette in Spanish to daughters of new-money Parisian families. The work was humbling for someone who'd aspired to be a princess, but it was honest and sustainable. More importantly, HAZEL had started a small salon for expatriate Spanish women in Paris, creating community among those far from home. Thank you, HAZEL wrote simply. I'm learning that being needed is more satisfying than being envied. It's a hard lesson, but perhaps a necessary one. Isabella filed the letters away, unsure if this strange détente with her former enemy would last, but feeling that she'd made the right choice. Forgiveness wasn't about forgetting the past, it was about refusing to let the past consume the future. Summer brought news that rocked Madrid's aristocratic circles. Queen Regent Maria Cristina announced a royal education initiative, pledging government support for expanding literacy programs across Spain. The announcement specifically praised Isabella's work as a model for what private-public partnerships could achieve. Isabella was invited to the palace to consult on the initiative's implementation. Walking through those gilded halls again felt surreal, but this time she entered as an expert being sought for her knowledge, not a wife being tolerated for protocol. The meetings included ministers, educators, and representatives from universities. Isabella presented detailed reports on her school's operations, sharing both successes and failures, offering practical guidance rooted in real experience. During a break between sessions, the Queen Regent asked Isabella to walk with her in the palace gardens, the same gardens where that devastating spring banquet had taken place 3 years ago. The roses were in full bloom now, their scent heavy on the warm air. I've been watching your work with great interest, Maria, Cristina said. You've accomplished something remarkable, and you did it without waiting for permission or support from the institutions that should have helped. You from the beginning. I had no choice, Your Majesty. I had to build something or disappear. But you chose to build something that helps others, not just yourself. That's the remarkable part. The Queen paused by a fountain, watching water cascade over marble. I'm going to be direct, Isabella. I want you to join the Royal Council on Education Reform. It's an official position with a salary and real authority. You'd be the first woman to hold such a position in Spain's government. Isabella's breath caught. This wasn't just recognition, it was power. Real, institutional power to shape policy and allocate resources. Everything she'd been doing on a small scale could be expanded nationally. The Conservatives will fight this, Isabella said carefully. Appointing a woman to a government council, especially one with my history, let them fight. I'm the Queen Regent, and I decide who serves on my councils. More importantly, you have results they can't argue with. Your schools work. Your methods are proven. And if Spain is going to compete with the rest of Europe, we need to educate all our citizens, not just the sons of aristocrats. Maria Cristina's voice carried steel beneath the diplomatic language. So I'm asking directly, will you accept this position? Isabella thought of little Maria writing stories about becoming a teacher, of Lucia's baby surviving because someone intervened at the right moment, of hundreds of girls learning to read in cramped classrooms across Madrid, of the potential to scale all of it across an entire nation. Yes, Your Majesty, I accept. The announcement caused exactly the scandal Maria Cristina had predicted. Conservative newspapers railed against a divorced woman being given government authority. Some aristocrats boycotted court functions in protest. Even some of Isabella's allies questioned whether she was ready for such a prominent, controversial role. But Isabella had learned not to fear controversy. She showed up to her first council meeting with detailed proposals and unshakable confidence. She spoke with the authority of someone who'd done the work, seen the results, and knew exactly what was needed. Slowly, even skeptics had to admit she knew what she was talking about. By autumn, the first government-funded schools based on Isabella's model were opening in Barcelona, Seville, and Valencia. The curriculum she'd developed was being adapted for rural communities. Teacher training programs were established at universities. The quiet revolution she'd started in one cramped lavapiés classroom was becoming national policy. On a cool October evening, Isabella hosted a salon that had become legendary in Madrid, the 3-year anniversary gathering. Everyone who'd supported her from the beginning was there. Dona Carmen, the Duchess of Osuna, the teachers from her first schools, the donors who'd taken chances on an unknown woman with ambitious ideas, the writers and politicians who'd made her salon a crucial stop for anyone interested in progressive thought. Isabella stood to give a toast, looking around at faces that had become family. 3 years ago, I stood in a palace antechamber watching my life collapse. I thought that was the end of everything. I was wrong. It was the beginning. Because sometimes we have to lose everything we thought we wanted to discover what we actually need. She paused, feeling the emotion rise in her throat. I need to thank all of you for seeing potential in a frightened, humiliated young woman who had no idea what she was doing. You taught me, supported me, believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. Everything we built together. The schools, the clinics, the policy changes, none of it would exist without this community. Dona Carmen raised her glass. To Isabella, who turned humiliation into revolution. To Isabella, the room echoed. Later, as guests were leaving, Dona Carmen lingered. She looked older now, moving more slowly, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. I want you to know something, she said. In 30 years of watching court politics, I've never seen anyone accomplish what you have. You didn't just survive, you transformed the system. That tried to break you. I had a good teacher. You had the courage to learn. That's different. Dona Carmen touched Isabella's cheek gently, a rare gesture of affection. Your mother would be so proud. I wish she could see what you've become. After everyone left, Isabella stood alone in her library, looking at the artifacts of her life. The silver brooch that had been her mother's, the first letter of support from the Duchess, the program from the National Conference, student drawings covering one wall, letters from girls who'd learned to read in her schools. This was her legacy. Not a title, not a marriage, not social position, but this tangible evidence of lives changed and futures opened. She thought about the girl she'd been at 23, so desperate to please, so afraid of disappointing anyone. That girl was gone, replaced by a woman who'd learned that the only person she truly needed to please was herself. Isabella picked up her journal and wrote, Today I realized that the worst thing that ever happened to me, that humiliation at the spring banquet, was also the best thing, because it forced me to become who I was always meant to be. I wouldn't change any of it, even the pain, because the pain built the foundation for everything beautiful that came after. She closed the journal and looked out at Madrid's night sky. Stars visible despite the city's glow. Tomorrow she'd attend another council meeting, review applications for the new Valencia clinic, respond to letters from teachers across Spain. The work never ended, but she wouldn't want it to. Isabella de Alcantara had found her place in the world, and it was exactly where she